Aw, that's great.
Now, there's a lot of inside stuff that I'm not going to tell you about this reading lamp, but I know that she will find a great place for it so that she can sit on her couch with my dog and her reading lamp.
Thank you.
Finally.
Are we gonna sew? Oh, thank you.
We'll ship it to
Oh,
you.
perfect, thank you.
Phil, Phil has been instrumental in getting this thing done. He did the foreword for it, he's read everything in it. Another, JT, are you in here? John Torino has gone through here too, and if you ever want anything to be proofed, send it to John Torino. He's the best proofer I've ever seen in my life. I did the afterword, and what we wanted to do was just talk a little bit about what this book meant to us, and Bill has some really great insights to it. I have a couple at the end, and we wanted to go through a couple of the images and just tell a couple stories. But I'm going to ask Phil to start off with what he thinks this book means and why it's important that the foundation did it.
Thanks, Dick. I'm gonna echo something that he just said, and that was this. I read this book when it first came out way back when. I met the author, Pete Kopp, came to the academy. I was a young captain. I escorted him. It was really neat. I thought it was a pretty good book 40 years ago, whatever. I read it again about a year ago when Dick asked me to write this forward, and I realized it's a great book. I read it again a month ago, and I realized this is a uniquely great book because it tells a story which has simply not been told before. And that is what kind of amazed me, was that there are very few books written on the Air Corps. Lots of books on World War I, lots of books on World War II. But you get past Mauer's official history, and the list gets really short. And so that's what Pete Kopp did, was he wrote a book about the Air Corps, which was fantastic. And by the way, for those of you who are budding authors, I mentioned this to Brenda, there is not a single book out there that I could ever find, a novel on the Air Corps. Again, there's dozens, hundreds of books on World War I, on World War II, on the Cold War. There's nothing on the Air Corps. And that amazes me because you would have thought that this is a golden age. So this is the time of rampant technology when things are going crazy as far as records being broken and whatnot, and aircraft and engines and stuff like that being built. But there's virtually nothing out there on that subject. Of course, the golden age of thought, the Air Corps Tactical School developing the doctrine of high-altitude daylight strategic bombing, which we're going to take into World War II. All that is happening at the same time. You've got this amazing intra-service rivalry, which to me echoes so much as to sorts of situations that General Deptula was talking about just a minute ago. He didn't mention that overtly, but that's really what it's all about. When you're talking about a feeling of isolationism in the United States back in the 30s, combined with the Great Depression, the budgets are tight. And when budgets get tight, services look at the other service to cut their throats so that they can survive themselves in a bureaucratic gang fight. I get that. That's what was happening during the 1930s. You would have thought that would be a fascinating subject to write about, but few people actually do that. Again, I mentioned the technology and the doctrine. The General Staff was actually in charge, and this is in Kopp's book, which I think is very well brought out and which people don't realize because they think of all of this doctrine that's being articulated by people, these young lieutenants and captains down at the Air Corps Tactical School, and they're the ones putting out all of this stuff. Well, why is their story so well documented? Because they were writers and they kept all their notes. So you can go down to Maxwell and find an exact copy, literally a typescript of every single lecture that was ever given down at the Air Corps Tactical School. It's all still there. Whereas the people who were, in a large sense, actually making doctrine, those were the actual pilots out in the operational fields, out in Podunk Air Base, out in the middle of nowhere. But they didn't have time to write it down. They were too busy flying. They were too busy working. And so we're left with this story of the Air Corps Tactical School. That's okay. I don't really have a problem with that because it tells a great story. But I'll just say one thing and get to Dick because his pictures are really good, is that the general staff controlled everything. And unless you realize that, you don't understand what happened to the Air Corps. The airmen thought that they were used and abused. The airmen thought that they were not getting a fair share of the budget. They were not getting a fair share of promotions. They were not getting a fair share of airplanes that Congress allegedly told them that they were supposed to have. And why was that the case? And also the planes that they were getting was not necessarily the ones that they wanted. Came across a wonderful statistic from I.B. Holly, two of them actually. One of them he said was in the 1920s, 71% of all aircraft purchased by the Air Service / Air Corps were observation aircraft. 71%. And as late as 1939, the General Staff decreed that 37% of all aircraft to be bought by the Air Corps, 1939, would be observation aircraft. Over a third of the entire inventory. To put that in perspective, how many observation aircraft can you think of that flew during World War II? And the answer is 0, because they were immediately seen as being totally useless, worthless, and obsolete. We did not need aircraft for artillery spotting and battlefield reconnaissance anymore. And so that entire class of aircraft that the General Staff wanted over a third of our force structure to be was simply, it went away. It disappeared. So it was an interesting story, but you have to realize that the doctrine coming out of Maxwell was very important. But by the same token, remember that that was not the official doctrine of the Air Corps. The official doctrine of the Air Corps was written by the General Staff. The field manuals, the training regulations. If you want to find out what the Army, who controlled the Air Corps, really thought about the employment of air power, you have to go back and look at the field manuals. And most of those probably don't even exist anymore. I mean, you can find them online, places but most people don't, when historians look at this stuff, they don't look at that. But that is where the story of how aircraft were going to be used in future war, the official word existed, was in the Army field manuals, not the lectures, which were unofficial. That was just more theoretical coming out of the Air Corps Tactical School. Do I have time for one little anecdote?
No, go ahead.
Okay, one little anecdote when I talk about the General Staff. I came across the story from Pete Kopp. It's not in the book. It's in an article that he wrote later on, but it just struck me. Okay, so Frank Andrews is a major general, and he's commander of the GHQ Air Force, okay, which is, at that time, historians will realize it was kind of an autonomous branch within the Army, which controlled all the combat aircraft within the Air Corps. So that's a GHQ Air Force. Major General Frank Andrews is in charge of it. Okay. The chief of the Air Corps, who, by the way, was his classmate from West Point, but who he didn't get along with, was Oscar Westover. Okay. So Oscar Westover's killed in a plane crash. All right. So we need a new chief of the Air Corps. Who's that going to be? So Malin Craig is the chief of staff of the Army. He's going to make that selection. So who is the top-ranking airman in the United States? Well, it's Frank Andrews at GHQ Air Force. He's another two-star, all right? A temporary two-star. He brings him into his office, and a question he asks Frank Andrews is, if you get this job, will you stop advocating for more B-17s? Because that's about all Frank Andrews did, was advocate for more B-17s, because that was his job as the commander of the GHQ Air Force. And Andrews looked at him and said, no. He didn't get the job. Instead, he reverted to his permanent rank of colonel and was sent down to Fort Sam Houston to become the air officer for the 8th Corps area. Why is that significant? Because 14 years earlier, Billy Mitchell also got in trouble with the General Staff. What happened to General Mitchell? He reverted from his permanent rank to his permanent rank from general down to colonel and was sent down to the 8th Corps area in San Antonio to take that job. So Frank Andrews got the same job, the same office, the exact same desk that Billy Mitchell had been exiled to earlier. That was not a subtle message by the United States Army. So I think Kopp brings all this stuff up about the milieu, the people. Wonderful, wonderful book. Okay.
It is. It's great. I just wanted to go over a couple of the images that are in this book that are not in Kopp's original stuff, because we wanted to tell a little more chronological of a story and bring in some more of the technology. This is a really good one. In November of 12, Arnold was flying at Fort Riley, Kansas, and took off with an observer who was going to take some pictures, and they were going to look for Army folks on the ground. And they ended up getting into a stormy condition, and he eventually ends up coming into land, and typically they did a spiral pattern down to land, but in this case, he overstalled the airplane, an accelerated stall, and got to a spin and started falling out of the sky from about 1,500 feet. And if you look at the image, you can see that's the takeoff picture, and you can see the low clouds in the background. But what you see with that little graph there is a barograph. It was a little measuring device that was on that airplane, and you can see that there's a gap in the little black line there that goes from about 800 feet down to the ground, almost. And Arnold always described that flight as miraculous, because he basically took his hands off of the controls with ALP Sands in the deputy seat there. The airplane righted itself 10 feet above the ground, and he landed. They got out of the plane in the middle of the field and walked back to what is base ops. And he didn't fly again for 4 years after that particular episode. But there was tech in the planes back then. Nobody knew what it was or how it worked, but that's one of the rare occasions where it was used. They were doing some early radio experiments, and that's from the ground, some of the radio equipment. I wanted to get to one of the stories that Kopp spends a lot of time on. There's Billy Mitchell with Pershing at a parade. He talks a lot about an episode where the Italian Air Force under General Balboa made a kind of a semi-around-the-world mission in the 1930s and ended up flying through the north central part of the United States, through Detroit, and ended up flying to Washington before anybody in America had thought about doing that. Here was an unexpected international air force demonstrating long-range air power before the United States had ever done it. They were a superior force at the time, and shortly thereafter, America's Air Force started to change a little bit. And the way that Balboa was treated was he was actually invited to the White House for dinner with the president for accomplishing such a great feat, because we couldn't have done it. And the fact that's so interesting is that Kopp spends several chapters on this. But when he talks about the Alaska flight, for example, where 10 B-10s fly to Alaska and back 18,000 miles and have very few things go wrong, less than a chapter. Why? Because there's no story here. You know, it's one of the things that are alluded to. I know Phil talks about it. I've talked about it. The Air Force always has made its job seem too easy. And it's one of the reasons that what General Deptula was talking about is one of those underlying things that happen. When you make your job seem like it's too easy to everybody out there who does not know anything about the Air Force, then you've not done yourself a great service. And it's time to blow your own horn just a little bit. This is the Army Air Corps' first unmanned aerial vehicle. It was built with a Ford two-stroke engine. It had a gyro in it. It flew by itself to a barometric setting, and the controls were moved by a piano bellows setup. The propeller was hooked to a counter, and so after a certain number of propeller revolutions, there would be a little guillotine that would cut the fuel line the fuel would leak out and it would crash with its 250-pound bomb in the nose, and that was going to be used during World War I. Hap Arnold got on a ship with one of these and got the flu. I mean, big flu, the World War I flu, the Spanish flu, and never got to see General Pershing. The war ended and he never actually got to fly this. 45 of these were built in a hangar in Dayton, and they never made the trip. But for all of you folks who are interested in unmanned aerial weaponry, that's when it started for us. Our technology sometimes takes a hair to develop, time-wise. That's the Mitchell bombings. I'm going to skip through that a little bit. Some of the stories we tell are around technological achievements, like I think Bill Strandberg asked, or somebody, about the around the world, or around the nation flights that were done, and Jimmy Doolittle's flight from coast to coast in the 20s. All of that during this period of time where nobody really knows much about airplanes. In the 20s even, a lot of people had never seen one. And now we're hearing that you can fly across the country in 24 hours and that type of thing. And oh boy, in the 20s, when you could get an airplane to stay in the air for more than 2 hours at a time, well, that was just a plumb miracle too. And I think this is the 1924 version that Hap Arnold enticed his 4 young lieutenants to do over Rockwood Field in California, to test refueling, which was basically throwing a tube down into the air. Somebody grabs it, sticks it into the top wing, and then you kind of fling a 5-gallon jug of oil down the same line. Somebody puts it into the airplane and keeps on flying. But the real one that did the publicity stunt, and there's 2 of the lieutenants, Lieutenant Hine is in the middle, was the more famous one with Carl Spaatz and the question mark, which I'll get to here in just a second. The question mark in 1929, this is the Mitchell, or the Mitchell bomber.
Arling.
There was only one of these Barlings built, the Barling bomber. And the real interesting story, other than that it really could only land in 2 airfields in the country, was that Hap Arnold had it burned to the ground when he was at Materiel Command, so he could make room for getting more bombers into the force. And this is the first round the world flight. But the point of this book is I got to do a talk in front of the Arnold Air Society at their national convention. Were any of you folks there at the NatCon? And I asked the question, how many of you have seen or read A Few Great Captains? And there were 10 out of 700 that raised their hands. So I would say to you who are involved with education and you're in the staff groups and you have access to get this out there, is we need to have our young people read this book. They need to understand that what we're going through right now is not anything that's new. It's been done before, it's just been done in a different way. And one of the great outcomes of this book is that for the foundation, this is our primary mission, to get this out there to everybody. This book is free. It's free. You download it on the internet. You could do this in every ROTC classroom, every Air University, anything, everywhere that can be out there. We can get it to the Navy. The Navy ought to read it too. But that's one of the things that the foundation has in the past been known for, that we are rekindling now for everybody that are not just our members, but are out in the service that can benefit from the lessons. The last word I'll say about it is comparisons have been made about the Space Force and the Marine Corps to the Navy and then to the Air Force. I think that's wrong. I think the real comparison between the Space Force and some other group is more like the GHQ Air Force to the Army Air Corps. They're a separate group with a distinct, very distinct mission, and they're still under the thumb of the Mother Air Corps. There's going to come a time where that specific mission, like strategic bombing for the United States Air Force, which separated it finally from the Army, there will come a time where it will become so pivotal to have a separate Space Force that will finally happen. My word caution to the Space Force and to those working with the Space Force is to be patient, because someday it will definitely occur. That's all we have time for. And we'll be around, I'll be around tomorrow. We can talk about it all you want. Everybody ought to just go download this book. It's well worth the time and the effort. And I think you're going to be able to actually get a hard copy from AU Press. That's all we have. Now,
Mention the footnotes.
oh, one of the biggest concerns or problems with the original A Few Great Captains was the footnotes weren't available. Now, through a link to AU Press, everybody can go to DeWitt Kopp's footnotes and all of the notes, the research notes, and they're copious, multi-hundreds of pages of copious. And so all of that is exceptionally valuable to understanding the outcome of why this book is so important. Okay, great. Okay, no applause necessary. We're going to take 5 minutes for our space panel to come up, and if you need to take a quick one, that's fine. And we'll get that started as soon as possible.